Going live.
Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to the shop. And tonight we have a special guest, Brad Robinson. I'll talk about that in a minute, but we're going to be looking at edges and sharpening and what is all of we're going to go a little bit deeper into it normally than just rubbing steel on something that sharpens it. So upcoming things, there's not too much other than I will be doing an odd giveaway on Christmas Day, so stay tuned for that. It'll be a short video coming out, so if you want to get something from the Wood by Wright store, we'll be doing a giveaway on that, so stay tuned. For those of you wanting to go to a Workbench Con in March, they just put up all of the speakers, so I will be doing a panel there, as well as one of the guest bench talks. So if you're coming to that, looking forward to seeing you. So let's actually dive into this. So I've got Brad Robinson here, and he has been edge making, sharpening, and been teaching it for about 10 years now. He runs oh, come on. Mind blank. Why don't you tell us about you and your company?
So Cutting Edge Custom Sharpening, and I've been doing this full time for just over 10 years, and started out in cutlery and hair and fur equipment, and since then it's grown to just about everything under the sun except for carbide tools. So it's been a heck of an adventure. Yeah.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to see more about the company and things like that, I have links to all that down in the description down below. And he does also sharpen saws as well. So for those of you who don't like doing that, here's a good contact for you.
Absolutely.
So, Brad, why don't you tell us about yourself? What's your background? How'd you get into it?
So background is I went to school for music education and performance, and through a very roundabout way, I ended up in the sharpening business. Where it ended up being something that I really fell in love with. So got right into it and started out with a Tormek that I got from somebody in the UK for $50. And now it's grown to everything from complete cutlery restorations to repairing and maintaining historical collections, all kinds of stuff. But it's kind of a weird shift from playing instruments and teaching instruments to all of a sudden making sharp and shiny toys. But yeah.
And for those of you wanting to draw the connections, Brad is actually the one who sent in the bedeviled plane that we did about a month ago with the red lever cap. So with talking with him, he's got an amazing, not demonstration, production on not just how do you sharpen, because you've seen hundreds of videos on how do you sharpen, but what actually happens at the tip and how shaping different things and different applications really goes into it. So tonight we're going to be taking a look at that. But before we do that, I want to dive into the why. Why do you do what you do? What's your passion right now?
I think it was a complete departure from anything else that I had done. And so when I started it and was sharpening for a couple of folks and then also working in the instrument building and customization world and figuring how to sharpen those tools, there was something very craft about it that the instrument building gave me. But for the amount of time it took to do the custom work on instruments and how little money you potentially made per hour, I found out that if you can sharpen a knife really well in a minute to a minute and a half at $5 a blade, you still have the craft side. You're still going to see really cool stuff and have to do some of that finer detail work. But in general, more people that you meet appreciate what you do, where my previous life was a very niche community of professionals, where now everybody from the grandma down the street that likes to sew on the weekends and needs her Ginger shears done to professional chefs from around the country that send me their sushi knives to be repaired and customized. it has all the craft and technical handwork aspects that I love from my previous life in instruments, but there's a lot more variety, a lot more stuff that goes on. You meet a lot more interesting people, and I don't think I really could look back in any other way. Just kind of fell in love with it. It fell in my lap. I fell in love with it, and from then it's just been this continual journey where sometimes I kind of want to just give up and quit, but in the end, it's all worth it.
Well, I have to say, in talking to you, you're a fairly sharp guy, so.
You know, my business, we only sharpen steel. We do not sharpen wits.
Now, it's one of the interesting things that I ran into when getting into hand tools is the big departure, excuse me, from hand tools to power tools wasn't as much the efficiency. The efficiency is what drove it. But
Sure.
the reason that hand tools disappeared is that with power tools, you don't sharpen them. They're disposable. Unless you really have an expensive one, you generally don't sharpen them. And that lack of sharpening skill led to dropping all hand tools, because all hand tools require sharpening. And it is one of those basic skills that once you master sharpening in one aspect, you can apply that to others. And every aspect is going to have some slight variations, but once you figure out how to make something sharp, it becomes useful.
I pull out my little Makita little hand surface plane that I have and be like, yeah, I sharpen those blades. You know, the aspect of disposability only goes so far. When there are certain things in the sharpening world, especially for woodworking or more industrial knives, you have to have specialized machinery. You have to have a setup that's indexable, because if you're just a little bit off in one direction or another, or instead of that little plain blade being absolutely flat, so when it sits into that drum, it's spinning the correct way. If it's just the littlest bit off, now you start running into just playing out a board, and now you've got this giant gouge that you can't get rid of, and it keeps coming back. You know, chainsaw chains, you can do them with a file, but when you have the proper equipment to set it up, then it becomes easier. But large planers, large industrial tools, especially, you know, large fabric companies that have these huge guillotine cutters, that's when you get into more specific process sharpening. But I think the thing that's really cool about how I approach edge making in general, and what I've learned from the various individuals who have taught me and I've learned from, is that there is a difference between sharpening and edge making. And we'll dive into that once the presentation starts. But once you have a grasp on a few of those things, there are a lot of power tools that can be sharpened and you can make edges on, and it limits the disposability aspect.
Yeah.
And especially in the hair and fur world, I deal with a lot of clients that have had sharpeners that give 3 sharpenings on a shear, time to buy a new one, and their sole purpose is to grind metal off the shear so they can sell them a new one. Stylists in their drawers have probably $3,000 to $6,000 worth of shears alone that sharpeners have said they're dead, and so they keep buying new. I'm really interested in the aspect of, let's take what you own and let's take what's out there and make it usable. Yeah. If you can take a 1930s Stanley plane or an Enfield plane and you can set that thing up and make it work for another 100 years, let's do it. Let's figure out the fundamental mechanics and the fundamental understandings that go behind that. So, you know, maybe a little bit of that disposability aspect becomes more of a moot point.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I had some carbide router bits, and you think, you know, carbide, you got to have something special. But honestly, if you get a diamond paddle, spend a little bit of time on it, is it going to be absolutely perfect? No, but it's going to be way better than it was before. And yeah, you can take a little $5 router bit and make it work better.
You know, there's 1,000 ways to sharpen something, but there's one way to do it wrong, and that's where it gets worse than it was before.
Yeah.
But, you know, even like hole cutters, people don't think that a hole cutter can be sharpened. Well, I took some from somebody that I knew out in the Midwest. I made myself a little hole cutter sharpening jig out of synthetic Corian countertop, drawer slides, a sewing machine motor, and a diamond disc that you use for doing slitting and to sharpen a hole saw. Yeah.
Cool. Well, so the way it basically is going to work is I'm going to turn it over to Brad here in a moment. And so if anyone has any questions, throw those in the chat. And if they are pertinent to the discussion where they're at, Sarah will raise her hand and we'll break in. But otherwise, we'll hold the questions to the end and hit all those along the way. So I'm actually going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Sarah, why don't you hit the full screen then?
Perfect.
She's doing her nails already.
Let's
It's all Brad now.
All right. So hopefully you guys can see the little slideshow now, right?
Yep, looking good.
Cool. So easiest way to get in touch with me is via email. Right there, brad.cecs, Charlie Echo, Charlie Sierra @gmail.com. That's the easiest way to get in touch with me. In the wintertime, I work as a ski instructor, so I'm on the mountain a lot when the snow falls till the snow melts. So email is always easiest. But the quick recap here, I've been 10 years full-time in edge making, a little bit of a knife maker and tool maker, but that's more out of a passion for sharp, shiny toys. It's not something that I really focus on. But in the beginning, I specialized in cutlery as well as hair and fur equipment, which is really specialized, especially hairdressing shears. It's a very special thing. But getting into what we're doing this evening and what we're going to talk about kind of comes from this statement. Without knowledge and understanding, we can't build fundamental skills and techniques. If we don't necessarily have a foothold and a grounding point in how and why edges form and what are the results of edge making, then the steps we take and the various abrasives and grit and all that really doesn't matter. That we need to kind of understand how this all comes together and what that can mean for a high performance edge and an efficient edge. So what we're going to discover this evening, hopefully, I just got to move something off of my screen here. There we go. We will discover answers and understanding to the difference between edge making and sharpening, a unique way to think about how the edge is formed and why. Why is edge geometry important and what is it? Burrs, you can spell it with one R or two or three or four, doesn't matter. But burrs, are they important indicators and do they tell us something? As well as a quick overview of what heat treating is and why tempering is only a small part of the whole picture. And I think there's some misconceptions that we can dispel this evening, and hopefully that'll give us a little bit better understanding of the materials we're working with. So sharpening versus edge making. Sharpening usually requires a process, techniques, or steps that are relatively unmovable or modifiable. I meant to say non-modifiable, but I'm not a great typist. Typically and traditionally taught as a step-by-step method to achieve a result. Edge making dives into the craft of creating efficient edges through an understanding of fundamentals that produce techniques and skills. Edge making can also allow an individual to create and craft edges and geometries that best suit the needs of the cutting task. And here we have a Foster Brothers cleaver with a convex surface here for the edge. And we also have a very high-end, very expensive Japanese convex hairdressing shear. The required cutting task on the shear is very different than the cleaver. They're both convex geometries, but how those geometries are set up and to what degree and what steps are taken to get there, yeah, they're both pretty mirror polished. But the end result of how they were set up means that each edge type will do its job correctly. If I put the shear edge on the cleaver edge, it's going to fail. And and vice versa. So how is an edge built? I like to think of edges as a roof, okay? And this concept comes from a gentleman who wants to remain anonymous, but he's very well known in knife making. And here I have a child's drawing, so to speak, of a house with a roof. We don't start by building that roof by building the spine of the roof and then the two faces come together. We start by building the two faces, and when they come together in balance, an apex is formed. That spine, that apex, is a result of those two faces meeting at their appropriate point in balance. Here we have a basic picture of a chisel, right? One primary bevel going all the way out to the apex and the flat on the underside of the tool. Well, this is face one of the roof. This is face two of the roof. But this also is in balance. Why? Because a chisel needs to have that apex somewhat near or in line with that flat face. So even though it's off-sided, it's still balanced. Here we have a traditional Western style, German or French style chef's knife, right? Convex secondary edge geometry with a bevel at the face, same thing. One side of the roof, other side of the roof. Where they meet in balance is where it needs to be, and the result is the apex. So we need to have some considerations for edge making before we can even start any processes. We need to know what the intended use of the tool is. Are you slicing sashimi, or are you splitting tree stumps? What kind of a tool are you using? I'll let you fill in the blanks. What material are you cutting or working? Do you need stout and toothy, or really slick and smooth? Does the material have a high silica content like bamboo? That might require slightly different considerations than another type of material. Lastly, can the steel support the kind of edge you need? Do you really need to go through 15 different grits and 9 different micron diamond emulsions when a cinder block and cardboard can make a knife shave? And I will mention Murray Carter with Carter Cutlery. He actually has a YouTube video of him sharpening a knife on a cinder block, stropping it on a piece of cardboard, and shaving with it. So if you don't believe me, there are Japanese master bladesmiths like Murray Carter who actually demonstrate this point. So going back to the initial idea that if we don't have a basic understanding of how edges come together and how they work and what they mean to be in balance, then sometimes going through 1,000 different grits is necessary to get our result when we could have done it with 2. So something to keep in mind. We also have to define parts of edge geometry. Edge geometry is not exclusive to the primary edge and the primary faces. Okay? So down here, simple drawing of a knife or any tool with 2 primary edge bevels. We have the apex, which we already know is a result of working the 2 faces of the primary edge, the sides of the roof. But we also have secondary edge geometry, which is anything above the primary edge towards the spine or towards the handle if it happens to be a chisel, right? So with that being said, here's a chisel. All aspects of the bladed tool, if all aspects of the bladed tool is not adjusted over time, the performance of the edge itself will suffer. So if this is our chisel, and that is the original primary edge, there's the apex, this is the flat. Let's say that that's at 35 degrees, hypothetically. As we sharpen back through this tool, that angle there, yeah, it's still at 35 degrees, hypothetically. But now look at all of the height and material thickness behind that edge. And now look at how much there is. Where this edge might have had a little bit of ductility and may have been a little bit keener, this edge geometry and performance may still be wickedly sharp, but it might bite or dig in. If you've ever had a chef's knife that's been sharpened a bunch of times and you go to cut, it's wickedly sharp, but it feels like it wedges into the food. This is a perfect example of that. Edge geometry is not just reliant on the angle of the primary edge to the angle of the other side of the primary edge. It's also relative to the ratios behind it. So in theory, by shaving this surface down as we sharpen the primary edge geometry, now that ratio can stay the same. Now we're using the same tool through its life rather than a tool that starts to slow down even though it's sharp. So thinking about a blade holistically, not just the aspects that create the apex, but everything behind it, can in turn produce a more efficient edge and produce a tool that lasts longer without slowing down. Right? And that's kind of our goal, is to have something that lasts us a long time. Now within those faces, we have three basic types of face geometries. Flat, right? That's flat. That's flat. Two straight lines. It is the hardest to create. It is strong and it is accurate, but it can bog down if anything goes awry with it. Why do I say it's the hardest to create? Even if you use a piece of granite with some type of powdered abrasive, or a piece of plate glass, or you have a diamond surface stone, the chance of on a microscopic level, that surface being absolutely flat is slim to none. In general, to produce a truly flat geometric surface, you need to use an indexable tool of some kind, a piece of machinery like a bed knife grinder or a CNC type machine. Anything outside of that tends to be convex. If you work on a stone freehand sharpening, 99% of the time you're producing some type of a convex geometry. Our upper bodies, our arms, are not really necessarily built for lateral or true linear motion. Our wrists and our elbows are hinge joints. Our shoulders are the only rotary joint that we have from the neck down through the hand. So we're taking rotary motion from the strongest joint, we're turning that into linear motion with the elbow, the second strongest joint, and then all the fine motor skills between the wrist, the hand, and your metacarpals, which are your finger bones. You know, there's a lot in the way there. So even if you use jigs or something else, the chance of it being flat or anything else, you're probably making some kind of a convex. But the best part about convex, it's incredibly strong. There's a reason why convex geometry has been used since as far back as 1267 and 1230 in Japan. Like, it's just the most common edge geometry type. It's strong, it works, it's awesome. Now, my favorite, but also tends to be the weakest, is hollow grinding, okay? It can get wickedly sharp. Look at how little material there is right behind that apex. It's incredibly thin. However, that may break down more quickly. When people use a Tormek, nothing wrong with a Tormek. Love my Tormek. But when we tend to hone that edge out a little bit, at least I do, I tend to raise the angle just a hair to put sort of a micro bevel just behind that apex. Not because, and most often it's taught this way because people say, oh, well, you know, it saves you time. You don't have to sharpen through as much material. When in reality, it creates a stronger edge. Basically, what you're doing is creating a convex shape with two hollow ground surfaces. It's weird, but that's sort of how it works. Hollow grinding is amazing. There's a reason why straight razors are hollow ground. Produce incredibly thin and flexible geometries, but they could potentially break down faster. What about the burr? Well, the burr tells us about balance. So we talked about that roof, right? When two surfaces come together in balance, the result is that apex. When a burr forms, it's the result of one side of the roof overtaking the other. Then it can be a result of other things, but in the most simplest form, it means that one side of that roof is stronger than the other, so it's taking over a little bit of the other side's space, right? And the way the burr acts or feels tells us about the steel, the heat treat, and or what we've done up to this point. You know, a really hard, aggressive burr that doesn't go away can tell us either that it's low carbon or soft steel, the steel wasn't tempered or heat treated properly. Oftentimes, if you get knives or if you get chisels that have bluing on the edge geometry behind the apex from somebody else, and you go to sharpen it, that burr just rolls right over, and you can't get rid of it because that area has lost all of its hardness and potentially lost some of its carbon too. Decarbonization is a very real thing if you heat up a blade. You could also be working with too much pressure on the blade, and we'll talk about edge deformation a little bit later. Or you could be trying to take the steel beyond its capability. Now, if you take a piece of Chinesium and you're trying to work it on a 1,000th of a micron CBN emulsion on a kangaroo leather strop, probably is not holding that edge. It probably is incapable of it. So that's another aspect to look at. Edge making is a multifaceted process by which we analyze all of what we do to produce an efficient edge. Now, we've all seen edges, especially on inexpensive knives. We sharpen them up, and you get that flaky, wobbly burr. And if you look at it closely, it looks like these little flakes or feathers of steel that are kind of just flapping in the wind. And even if you go in with a tweezer and try to pluck it off, there's one right behind it. 9 times out of 10, cheap Chinesium with less than 0.4% carbon in the steel. Low carbon spring steel, 1045 and 1065 are notorious if you don't heat treat it properly for having a very flaky and very feathery burr. It can also be caused by grain growth from heat treatment. And basically what that means is that the grains of the physical steel have gotten too large. And so what you're seeing is very large bits of carbide and other alloying components that have kind of clumped together are still holding on. And when they flake off, you're left with sort of a micro serrated, warpy edge. And you actually can get it going too fine with a grit or micron of some kind. Though it's rare to see that, it can happen. But I would say that that's, you know, when you hear hoof prints, don't go looking for zebras kind of thing. So with all this in mind, I know I've kind of hurried through a lot of this. Some tips for success with regards to all of this. Only use enough pressure to achieve the result. And what do I mean by pressure? How are you holding the tool against the abrasive, and how much downward force with your hand or a jig or a device are you applying to keep those two things in contact with each other? Too much pressure, the face of the tool can be deformed and can bend, causing an imbalance or uneven geometry. Something that a lot of knife makers will do when they produce really high quality cutlery is they'll do an edge flex test. You take a Bic lighter and you press the edge of the knife into the side of the Bic lighter. It creates a little point load, and you can actually see the edge bend and spring back to shape. That's a sign of a really good heat treat. If it bends and stays there, well, you got problems. But think about that when you're sharpening. If you're pressing too hard, and you can do it with some of the most hard and most difficult to work with carbide steels, CPM steels, you name it, nano powdered steel, You can deform an edge with pressure. I've seen it. You can do it. If you're pressing too hard, you are causing that edge to bend, and now you're chasing the apex, which is when people start to raise up on the stone or abrasive, and they're like, oh, I'm not getting a burr, I'm not getting a burr. Well, chances are that that edge is deflecting and bending away from the abrasive, so you're not even contacting the space leading up to the apex. Also, your abrasive mediums, whether it's sandpaper or it's silicon carbide or aluminum oxide powders, or it's a wet stone, natural stone, Arkansas stone, concrete, cinder block. The surface of that abrasive medium under a microscope looks like tiny little mountains of cutting grain. When you press too hard into an abrasive medium, you're trying to explore the valleys of that abrasive, when we really should be exploring the tops. The reason why abrasive grains cut is because of the sharp pointed tops of those mountains and the edges of those mountains. So if I don't use as much pressure, one, I'm not going to wear out my stone or sandpaper or other medium as quickly, but also I can control how aggressively that abrasive medium cuts into the tool. So I could take a 240 grit whetstone or a Norton India stone and make a shaving sharp edge just with that, all by how I apply downward pressure into the tool onto the abrasive surface. And the last thing that's important that I think gets neglected is wherever you contact the blade to hold it to the abrasive, that's where you'll cut. If your finger pressure is closer to the top of the primary edge where it meets the secondary edge, you're probably going to be grinding more behind that edge. If you contact just at the edge, you're going to grind there. So being conscious of where you're touching your blade is going to be important, because that's going to tell you a lot about how you're forming your edges and why you might be seeing certain things in your sharpening that you otherwise didn't quite think about. Which leads us to, how sharp is sharp? Well, this goes into honing a little bit and the misconception between honing and polishing. If we think about the faces again, faces of the roof, and the apex being a result, the more we refine those faces, the smoother and more keen the apex will be. Remember, the apex is a result of what we do to the faces and how we set those. So that's really important. If you want a keener, more, I don't know, scary or whisper sharp edge, well, then probably you're going to want to refine those faces and really dial them in to get that result. A lot of times honing is overemphasized. Remember, and I'll at some point, if I'll send James a link to the Murray Carter video, so he can throw it up on his wherever he may throw it up. I'll send that over so y'all can see. Cinder block and cardboard is all you need to get a shaving sharp edge. One of the demonstrations I used to do is I would take a completely dull axe or a little like scout hatchet. I would work it against a stone, a piece of cinder block, and then I would strop it out on an India stone and shave with it. It's doable. Also, the tooth of an edge is relative to the final abrasive used prior to any deburring method. So even if you think you've gotten rid of the burr, there's still a bit of a cutting burr at the apex. A 6-micron stone will leave a much finer scratch pattern than a 30-micron stone. But, you know, once again, if you need to have a toothier edge, well, stop at a more aggressive grit or micron, and then do whatever deburring methods you need to then refine the surfaces so they will cut, but you still have that tooth that's there. That's customizing your edges to cut efficiently. quickly, I'll try to go over this, but I think we're kind of spreading our time a little bit. Double, triple, cryo, tempered, super steel. Double tempered for maximum hardness is like saying balsa wood is harder and tougher than lignum vitae. No, it's not. 3 stages to making steel hard. You have the quench. Steel is heated to a specific temperature and held there. The steel is then plunged into a liquid between a plate or air cooled. This freezes the components and forms the final grain structure and state needed to hold an edge. Incredibly hard, stupidly brittle. It will shatter like glass. Tempering is the process by which we bake the steel so we can relax some of those stresses out of the steel, those internal stresses. We lose a little bit of hardness on the back end, but what we end up getting is a very well balanced steel. We have the desired amount of hardness and edge retention without it shattering. I like that. Cryo tempering or cryo treating. You can read this if you want, but basically what that means is some steels, some of the super steels, when they are quenched, they may only get to 90 or 94% of the final grain structure that is needed. What the cryo treat does is it very rapidly cools down the steel much farther, and it resolves any unresolved grain and transformation. For example, you have austenitic steel, martensic steel, 1095 being an example. When we do the quench, it changes to its final form. A cryo treat in certain steels just means it finishes that process. But double tempering, triple tempering does not do anything for our hardness. And cryo-treated steel versus uncryo-treated steel, there is really no felt difference to the end user. So there's my Facebook page. There's my Instagram. And I'm going to hand it back over to the Wrightses and let's see how we did.
Yeah, can you flip that back over, babe? Cool. Yeah, if you want to put your face back on there. Yeah, this covered a lot of stuff really fast.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure we had time for the questions that people really wanted to know about, and I can also post a PDF of this PowerPoint. I'll make a PDF of it so we can share that to those that want a copy of it as well.
Very cool. Yeah. Yeah, definitely send me a link to that video. I'll put that in the doobly-doo. So what, if you're watching, have questions, throw those in the chat. Sarah will pop those up and we'll get them. We have, about 20 minutes?
Yeah.
So let's see what we can get to.
First of all, can I just say that all I could think of when you first started was everyone's like, I don't use math after graduating high school. And I was like, he's starting with math. With geometry.
Yeah.
And they're
my kids are always like, I'll never use this.
Shapes. I mean, woodworking is all about making shapes that fit together. So
yeah. Luke and I were shooting a video, and we were finding centers because I was actually making a Chinese checkers board. So that's two isosceles triangles overlapping, and they're overlapping 1/3 of each other. They're overlapping 2/3 of each other, and getting all the geometry on that was absolutely ridiculous. I mean, it's straightforward, easy stuff, but the problem we were having is we were using the English system. Okay, what's a half of 7/8 and a quarter of that? And then we need 1/3 of that because we actually need 2/3. It's like, let's transfer it to decimals and do it the easy way. So what questions we got, babe?
All right. Let's see. Captain Hoke says, forgive the ignorance, but is it worth the time to take a fleam, I think that's the proper term, out of a saw and transfer to a rip file, or would it be easier to buy a new blade or cut new teeth?
Have you've done the changing a crosscut into a rip saw?
I've done it. Some of the folks in the saw making community that I've spoken to say it's best to just file the teeth down and recut. There's too many variables going one way or the other. Just start with a fresh a fresh straight, surface, and then cut in what you want after that. But I don't see why you couldn't take. I don't see why you couldn't take that geometry and change it up to be like, the hardware store multi-cut of some kind, where you have that hybrid geometry that does cross and rip.
Yeah. Now I found if I really want to do that, I joint them all down, not completely. If I want to keep the same TPI, I'll joint them down until I've got like a third of the gullet in the bottom, and then I've got all those notches then to make my new teeth, as long as I'm keeping it the same TPI.
Yeah.
But yeah, just trying to re-sharpen it.
I don't think you'd want to
end up with cabs and cows.
Like an old Atkins like this.
Good question. What's next?
Let's see. Red Storm asked, are there levels of tempering, or is it, you kind of talked about this, tempered or not tempered?
So there are levels of tempering. You can have some steels need one tempering cycle. Other steels need multiple. So something like 1095 or 5160, which is the old suspension spring steel, old Chevy Ford truck steel that you can make knives out of. Having multiple temper cycles where you bring it up to the tempering rate, which is typically somewhere between 4 and 450 Fahrenheit, and you let it sit for 2 hours, and then you let it cool all the way back down to room temperature, and then you bring it back up to 450 for 2 hours and let it come back down. That does two things. It helps to normalize the steel a little bit so it becomes a little more homogeneous. But it also means that you're not going to relax the steel all at once, that it's allowed to do a little bit, rest, do a little bit more, and rest. Some places, like I know for my W2 steels that I work with, I like to do 2 different temperature cycles. So the first one will be at a much higher temperature, so maybe 450 to 475 for a certain amount of time. Then I'll do the second temper cycle at 375, where, maybe it's something that I prefer. But in terms of cycling, having a multi-stage cycle, some steels benefit from that just because it can get some shock problems or some other issues. But generally speaking, unless you're doing something specific or you're working with a boutique knife maker or tool maker that wants to do a multi-stage cycle, usually the reason they'll do 2 or 3 stages is because that is what's recommended by the foundry that produced the steel in the first place, because they ultimately know best how that metallurgy works for that particular steel composite that they produce.
Yeah, we were talking earlier, there's, it's kind of interesting. I did the chisel test and the plane iron test, and there's several that use the exact same steel and the exact same tempering, but they perform wildly different between the impact of a chisel and the shearing force of a plane. In that some of the cryos, I can't remember which one Nerix uses, Nerix Richter, but the edge held up great to the impact, but then you use it in that same planing motion, and there really isn't that big a difference between one and the other.
That also comes down to geometry as well. If you look at a plane iron, a good, like a Lee Nielsen plane iron that has that little bit of extra thickness on it, the way that they set up the geometries, the way that they produce, because, typically a plane iron is going to be one thickness all the way through, and then you have that primary edge coming down and the flat on the back. Those are going to have a very different flexing quality to them and dynamic quality. So understanding that, where maybe the Richter, if doing that same plane test, if you put like maybe a 3 or 4 degree raise on the final edge and maybe bumped it a little bit, may have performed differently because now it could have been stronger or less thin. So that's, that could have been, I know that I have a bunch of knives that use blue #2 steel in the core, which is an amazing Japanese steel. Love blue #2. It's just awesome. I have 3 knives made by 3 different makers in the same year, and all 3 of them have completely different edge performances, and they're all identical shapes, identical concepts, and all 3 of them have drastically different edge performances because each maker puts their own concept into the geometries and everything else. So, you know, there's a part to that, but yeah, I mean, heck, you could get 4 buck 110 knives off the shelf at Walmart, and all 4 of them will stay sharp, drastically different.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the really interesting things when I did the chisel test. Is I get the comments all the time is, why don't they make steels as good as they used to make them 100 years ago? I'm like, well, they make them better now. Well, in some cases. With the interesting thing was with the chisel test is I got, I think it was 8 chisels from the same maker over different times, and the results from the exact same chisel on the exact same setup, the exact same sharpening, were wildly different because every batch is going to come out slightly different, especially back then when everything was done by eye in a furnace as opposed to.
Here, good example of that. Just reaching up there. Sorry for my very burly New Yorker kind of. It's cold outside. This is a Kikuichi. This is out of their gold series. Okay, it's a nickel Warikomi Damascus. Basically, that's fancy talk for the face is a high nickel steel Damascus. Let's see if I can get a decent picture of that. Focus. There we go. And then right at the edge, it's hard to see, but maybe you'll see it better on this side. Yeah. So if you look right there at the edge, maybe it's hard to see, but you'll see like the pattern disappears at a certain point, and then a core steel is revealed. It's hard to see in this video, but it's there. The core steel in this is drastically different than the core steel. Oh, no, this is the gold. This is the nickel Warikomi line. But this you might be able to see a little bit better. These are knives that I keep in my shop to teach, like if I'm doing Japanese knife sharpening. But you can see there's a core steel in there. Very similar core steels. But wickedly consistent. I couldn't tell you why. This knife is like 7 years older than this knife, but the 2 of them perform so consistently. And then I have some really high-end knives that were in the many 7,000s or more dollars a pop that I had to send back because they just sucked. It's hard to use the word, but they just sucked. And this knife is like under 300 bucks, by the way. I love Kikuichi. They are an amazing company. 1267 they were established, the oldest established knife company in the world.
Huh. Yep. What's the next question, babe?
Take that, poker.
Let's see. Nicholas Todd asked, all the chisel and plain blade videos teach us to feel for the burr. Are you saying that since pressure can cause a burr, it can be too much, and should we avoid trying for a burr?
I think the way the burr feels and looks is more important than trying to avoid it or achieve it. I think the burr is a result of establishing a face properly and showing that one face is overtaking the other. Burrs will form no matter what. Even honing on a piece of industrial felt without anything on it, stropping on the palm of your hand will produce a burr. If the burr is incredibly heavy, back off on the pressure. I mean, if you're white knuckling it, back off on the pressure. I think a burr is a good indicator tool. I think it'll tell you something about how you're sharpening. But there have been plenty of times that I have worked a plane iron of my own, and I could barely feel a burr. Then again, my thumbs are kind of burnt to heck, and I've lost sensitivity in them. But that's just because I was working incredibly lightly on a particular stone. People are taught to feel a burr. I wouldn't go chasing the burr without knowing that you're establishing the full face properly. And a great trick for that, this was actually something, oh man, I don't have one with me. Sharpie. Let's take a Sharpie marker. And you take a knife. You'd think I'd have a knife like right in front of me here, but you take a blade, take a Sharpie, color in that primary edge. Start working on your stones. When you flip it back over, you'll see exactly where you're sharpening. Mm-hmm. You can take Dykem blue layout fluid, put layout fluid on your tool, let it dry real good, and wherever you see that color being removed is where you're sharpening. Yeah. I would focus more on establishing the whole face rather than chasing a burr. If you're working that whole face uniformly, a burr will form as a result. If you're chasing the burr, chances are you're raising up too high against your abrasive, and now your edge angle has changed and your geometries have changed.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why you hear a lot of YouTubers talking about the burr is because if I'm teaching you over a camera, I can't let you feel this. I can't let you know, this is what sharp feels like. And the only way I can really do that is I'm going to do this. And at this point, I feel this burr. And it's a good way for me to describe what's happening. But
absolutely,
that doesn't mean you did it right. That doesn't mean you did it wrong. It just means you did that.
It's an indicator. In my mind, if I'm feeling the edge of something, and usually how I describe feeling for a burr, I have two tests of edge sharpness. One is a Murray Carter thing that I love. I have a law firm that's on retainer for my business, and they have told me that I need to say this every time I show it. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. But it's the best test of edge sharpness. So it's called 3-finger test of edge sharpness. Thumb on the spine. That is your safety. Okay? 3 fingers. I got to figure out which way I'm going. There we go. 3 fingers on the edge. Slightly stroke until you just feel that edge bite and slice. And when as a kid, you used to put a pin under that first layer of skin and freak out your teacher? What I'm trying to do is find out how much pressure it takes for the hairs that I don't have on the back of my neck to stand up.
Yeah.
If I get to a point where I'm white, I have white grips on my finger, and because I have people at shows that I go to go, oh, my knife's sharp. And I take my hand, now this is the spine, safe edge, right? And I just do this, and I go, that's sharp, right? So 3-finger test of edge sharpness will tell you about tooth and cutting capability. For the burr, how I feel for a burr, I'll turn this around. Am I in screen here?
Mm-hmm.
So what I do is I take my thumb, I start up where the primary edge geometry and the secondary edge geometry begins and meets. I stroke down. As I get closer to the edge, I go from the weight of my thumb to the weight of like 1/10 of my thumb. And if I feel the little pieces of my thumbprint catching kind of like a needle on a record, that's great. If I feel my thumbprint getting torn, then that's a hard burr from pressure or from angle change or something else. If I get really good with it and I stroke this way, which is opposite, and I get it in the right light, what I'll see is I'll see the little shine of the burr. And if I stroke it just the right way, I'll see it disappear. When you flip the blade over, you'll see it appear on the other side. That, to me, is the indicator of a good wire burr. Yeah. You should feel it scratch and interact with your thumbprint, but it shouldn't be scraping your skin off. It's not an exfoliation. It's a interaction.
Cool. What's next, babe?
Let's see. Red Storm asked, what's the best way to sharpen Damascus steel?
It depends. So
it's the best answer for most any question.
It depends. I mean, that's my favorite lawyer answer. It depends. You need to sharpen it very well. So the big dependent is it a Damascus steel that was produced in a country of quality and consistency, or was it produced in Pakistan? One of the big issues that we have, especially on Facebook Marketplace and guys around the country that are selling these really cool looking knives, and they show up to your door and they look like something that a crayon taste tester may have produced. And I'm sorry, that's not really PC, but that's the best way I can describe it. Pakistan is producing a ton of steel edged products. The quality is so subpar that it's not even worth sharpening. The quantity of lead and other highly dangerous metallic compounds in those steels, when it's aerosolized, you potentially could be risking your health. So I refuse anything that was made in Pakistan flat out. Don't send it to my shop. I will send it back in a hazmat bag. Depending on the tool, the best way to sharpen Damascus is to sharpen it as if it was any other steel, any other tool. If the edge geometry is too thick and it's wedging or it's getting bogged down on something, thin it out. If the edge is not holding and it's breaking down too quickly, make it fatter and stouter. Play with it, but don't think that Damascus has to be sharpened any way differently. The only time that there's a change, and I have to get this knife.
How many questions do we have left, babe?
The only time that there's a change is if you have a sushi knife. Hey, guess what? Another Kikuichi. I tell you, I love these. They're awesome. So this knife, if you can see, is a traditional clad knife. So that line, is where the core steel is, and it's removed from the cladded steel. Okay? When you sharpen anything that has a core steel with a cladding, you must adjust all edge geometry, because what will happen over time is you'll sharpen away the core steel, and now the cladding on the core has become part of the edge. Delamination will occur where the core steel and the cladding will separate. There's nothing you can do about that. With these knives, over time, and any knife that has a core steel with a cladding, you must be thinning constantly to ensure that that core steel has enough relief to where the cladding isn't being affected. So that's the only time Damascus or any other type of steel gets a specialty sharpening mention, is when you have to relieve that cladding to allow enough core steel to be present behind the apex.
Cool. We got two questions left, so let's try and hit these ones quickly, and we'll wrap it up. What's next, babe?
Rob Williams wants to know, what is the most common thing people get wrong with trying to re-sharpen anything?
They tried something they saw on YouTube or Pinterest.
Yeah. Now, the hardest problem I have with teaching it is letting someone know what is sharp. Because when you first get into sharpening, especially if you're trying to teach yourself on YouTube, it's just you're running through the thing of, oh, this is sharp, and then next time you sharpen a little bit more, it's like, oh no, this is sharp, and a little bit more, and it's like, oh, this is sharp. And
what I suggest, and this is when I train people to do hairdressing shears, what I suggest is somebody gets 3 sets of a competent quality tool that is not very expensive, that they can afford. One, they take to the curb on the street and you just beat the daylights out of the edge. The second one you use for a while, and the third one stays in brand new condition for the life of the tool. You do not touch it, you do not use it. You start with the beat to hell one, and you work it until it looks exactly like and feels exactly like the brand new tool. The second one is now practice on what took you 30 to 40 hours to fix, because you had its exact comparison to model after. Then, that's how I always suggest it. Buy 2 of something, buy 3 of something, so you always have the pristine factory condition. When I teach fabric shears and hairdressing shears, I get a bunch of flea market fabric shears. I will purposefully destroy one of the blades in the set, and the other one I will restore to factory condition, and I will send this or use it where they have to take my messed up blade and make it look identical and perform identical to the other half. Just have the model right in front of you. Have that direct comparison and use your eyes. We're woodworkers, we're craft people. We use our eyes critically. Be a critical visual inspector of what you're doing versus the brand new tool.
Cool. What's the last one, babe?
ChrisG says, I'm scared to try and sharpen a blade by hand. I really want to gain this skill to sharpen without a jig. How easy is it to ruin a plain blade learning by hand?
Ruin is a hard word because ruin means it can never be brought back to spec.
Yeah.
When I teach people to sharpen, the first thing I say is nothing you do to a tool I can't fix. So as long as you know someone who knows how to do something and you have that resource, don't be afraid to do it. Or go and buy a bunch of junk stuff. You know, go to Goodwill and find a bunch of really inexpensive, you know, go to Harbor Freight. I mean, I hate to say, go to Harbor Freight and buy a bunch of the cheap little block planes and just destroy those plane blades until you figure it out and then try it on something you like. But as long as you know of a quality, competent, and reliable sharpener, if you get to a point where you just can't figure it out, send it to them. You can send it to me. You can send it to James, I bet. And we can look at what you did and where it needs to go. And something I've done for my clients is I'll take a video of where it is. I'll take a video of what I do to bring it back and then show the before and after. So then you have a visual representation of that.
Now, when it comes to plane irons, you have that much steel to work through before it's ruined. And that's thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of sharpenings.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, you're not going to ruin it because it can always be fixed.
I was going to pull out my angle grinder and go, want to bet?
Yeah, and look, then there are those plane irons I get that you can tell that someone just took them to a grinder freehand and it's like a wave.
Oh.
And, yeah.
Oh.
As long as there's still material, you can bring it back.
That's it.
Cool. Well, I think that'll about do it. If you have any other particular questions, I'll leave a link to all of his contact down below. And,
Please do.
Reach out.
Yep. I don't charge for answering questions. Use me as a resource. I've been given a lot by those who taught me. And there are a lot of people around the world that have extended some pretty serious good graces my way to teach me things that are very difficult to learn and to get into. And the least I can do is pay that forward. So use me as a resource. Shoot me emails, get in touch with me on Facebook or Instagram, and I'm more than happy to help out any way that I can.
Very cool. Well, thanks for coming on tonight. And
thanks for
having me. Next time. Until then, have a wonderful day.
And Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Bye.
Got it. Cool.
Yep.
Well, thanks, man. That was absolutely awesome.